Hello, new prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for September 9th, 2021. Hope you're doing well on this day. So we have text for today. We have 2 Samuel 3, 1 Corinthians 14. Again, we've dealt with 1 Corinthians before, so won't spend a whole lot of time on that. We got Ezekiel 12, and then finally Psalm 51, which I actually just preached on a few weeks ago, so probably won't deal too much with that one either. So this might be a shorter one today. So first of all, why don't we start with 1 Corinthians 14? So remember that this whole section in 1 Corinthians is about the proper order within the worship of the church at Corinth, and also in this case the proper use of gifts, which is still kind of the big issue that's been the big issue since chapter 12. And then and it's also of course stressing the unity in the church. And part of the problem at Corinth was that there was much division over many different issues, but even in the worship of the church, and in this case, the exercise of gifts. And here Paul stresses, and I think this is an important thing to stress within the life of a church, is that those things that are valued in terms of gifts that we have, spiritual giftings, are valued because of their ability to edify the larger church body. Edify has the idea of building up, right? So those things that build up and don't tear down are those things that should be aspired to and sought after. And he compares, in this case, the gift of prophecy with the gift of tongues, which if tongues are used, he says, and we're not going to get into all the controversy. I can't remember if I think I probably did earlier in the year on what he means by tongues and what he means by prophecy. I think prophecy here is more like a spirit-led exhortation, but that's a disagreement among scholars. Tongues obviously is very much a point of disagreement among many denominations. But at the very least, I think what we can say here is that whatever use of tongues that there are here is not being used within the church for edification. And so Paul compares that to prophetic utterances, which are therefore, as verse 3 states, for edification, consolation, and exhortation. And so that gifting is the kind of gifting that should be ultimately valued, something that ultimately goes to the building up of a church. And I think that's true for pretty much anything within the church, any activity, any quality that we aspire to individually, we should aspire for those things that ultimately go to build up others, and particularly the church body itself. 1 Corinthians 14. Let's go over to, turn to Ezekiel. So we'll talk about Ezekiel 12. So this is an interesting chapter. Ezekiel is now doing another sign act that we see him doing several of these. And remember that really the first 33 chapters of Ezekiel are all about kind of preparing the way for exile. They are prophesying of the impending doom of Israel and other nations as we get to chapters 23 and following. And they are all focused on showing God's impending judgment on Jerusalem, on the temple, on this covenant people who have been disobedient to God. And here Ezekiel performs another sign act, and again, a sign act is an action that performs a sign, right, or that communicates a message ultimately. It's the words that are communicating, but it's also the actions. It's kind of like a physical illustration of the point he's making. And this is what God calls him to do in this case, is to get some baggage and act like he's going into exile. We actually have pictures of people that the Assyrians, for instance, earlier than this, taking people into exile and carrying their bags on their back. And here's what Ezekiel is going to do to indicate what's about to happen to the Jewish people. You'll notice, for instance, I noticed it a minute ago, where was it? Down in verse 16, that God says, I'll spare a few of them from the sword, famine, pestilence. We mentioned when we were talking about the book of Jeremiah, that these are those covenant curses from Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, Deuteronomy 32 that indicate, anytime you see those indicate those types of punishments indicated in the text, it is showing the reason ultimately for the exile that they're about to experience, for the judgment that they're about to experience. Pestilence, the only reason pestilence and plague and famine and sword, wild beasts, and all these other covenant curses from those texts are mentioned by the prophets, the only reason they are is to show ultimately the reason why they're going into exile. And it's because of their covenant disobedience. They have committed spiritual adultery with God. And so Ezekiel is here showing that this impending judgment has a reason, and it will happen ultimately for the Jewish people because of what they have done to dishonor that covenant relationship with God. As verse 28 says, none of my words will be delayed any longer. Whatever word I speak will be performed, declares the Lord. So this is going to happen. And Ezekiel's sign act definitely shows that. So let's move on to Psalm 51. Psalm 51, yeah. So again, I preached on this a few weeks ago. Remember that this is the psalm that David prays after being confronted by Nathan the prophet in his sin with Bathsheba. And of course, David is cut to the core as he is presented with this parable by Nathan. If you remember the parable from 2 Samuel, where Nathan confronts David as taking the lamb from the owner when he had all the sheep of the field, of the pasture. And David is cut to the core, and he confesses his sin before God, and he confesses his sin in a way, I think, that shows us something of the nature of true repentance and true confession, recognizing that his sin is against God, for instance, and God alone. We spent a lot of time in a sermon talking about that yes, he sinned against other people, sins against Uriah, sins against Bathsheba, against his family, against his nation, against himself. But when he confesses his sin, he says in verse 4, against you and you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. And he also confesses that it's only through God that this is going to be taken away. And it's not going to be through any kind of specific ritual. In fact, in Israel, sins done with a high hand, purposefully done sins, could not be removed by sacrifice. And so he recognizes that only God can blot out his transgressions. Only God can create in him a clean heart. Only God can renew a steadfast spirit within him. Only God can restore the joy of his salvation. So he recognizes not just why he needs forgiveness, but he recognizes the path of forgiveness. So there's much in here in Psalm 51 to point us to a path forward for a life of perpetual repentance, is what we talked about in the sermon, if you remember a few weeks back. You can go back and check on YouTube and catch that sermon if you want to, a few weeks ago. I can't remember exactly when that was, but you can go back and check that out. And then finally, in 2 Samuel chapter 3, we're seeing the continuation of David's consolidation of his power. And we have, remember that at this point in time, David is still in Hebron, ruling over the southern portion of Israel, what we would call Judah. And then Abner and Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, Abner, his commander, a cousin of Saul, are in the north. And what happens in this case is we have Abner, who is accused by Ishbosheth of taking one of the concubines of Saul, his father, his cousin in this case, but the father of Ishbosheth. And Ishbosheth accuses him of this, and Abner gets all ticked off about it, and so he goes and actually offers to give the king all the tribes and all the land and all the military of the northern part of Israel to David, and to consolidate all the power. Joab, the commander of of David's army is not too pleased with this. David accepts it, but Joab is not too pleased with this, and he goes and he ends up killing Abner. So David ends up then mourning Abner as a way of, I think, David's pretty wise politically here. I think it's a way of showing not only that did he kind of absolve himself of responsibility for this murder, but he also shows that he's kind of the good guy, right? He's mourning for the enemy, and it's a way of consolidating the kingdom ultimately under him. Notice that David doesn't punish Joab here. So anyway, it's still this whole point of the narrative in 2 Samuel at this point is talking about how David is becoming the king over this whole monarchy, this whole region, this whole nation. And this is what brings us to what will be called the United Monarchy in Israel. Saul kind of had that, but really it comes to a head with David and Solomon. And the United Monarchy really only lasts 80 years under David and Solomon, and then a few more if you add in Saul. So, but it was a significant period in the history of Israel. Again, this is going from around 1050 BC on down to 931 BC. So really not a long period of time in the history of Israel, but it's very significant for understanding what God is doing in salvation history to bring kingship and this messianic kingship into the story of history and into our story as well. So hope you have a great rest of the day. I think I hit all the text. I got 2 Samuel 3, I got 1 Corinthians 14, Ezekiel 12, and Psalm 51. Yep, got them all. So hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, September 9th, 2021.